Good evening to all of those who are joining us. We have just opened up the video feed here for our Lenten talk. We will wait quietly for a moment or two so that people can log in and join this feed so that we can start. We're just going to wait for a few moments so that people can join us, and then we will begin our Lenten talk for this evening. To those of you just coming in, we are just sitting quietly for a moment to give people time to log in and to join us, and we will start our talk here in just a moment or two. I pray that everyone is able to see and to hear without problems on whatever devices you're using to do it. So once again, we're just going to wait for a moment or two to allow more people to sign in, and in about a minute or two we will start our talk for this evening. I shall be right back in order for us to do that. All right, good evening and welcome to all of you who are here. It looks like there's a good number, goodness, already. I hope you can all hear me all right. My name is Bishop Irenei, for those of you who don't know me. And before we begin, let's simply start by saying a prayer, the traditional prayer by which we start most of our services and activities, the prayer to the Holy Spirit. O Heavenly King, the comforted Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us of all impurity, and of thy goodness save our souls. Amen. Welcome once again to all of you who have joined. I see that there are quite a lot of you here. I can see who some of you are, but not all of you, and it's nice to see people from all around the world, it seems, really. This is the first Lenten talk that our diocese has arranged and I've agreed to do in order for people who are at home during this period of the coronavirus and the quarantines and restrictions that are in place in many of our countries all around the world, which mean that people have to spend much more time at home that it is difficult and in most places now essentially impossible to gather with groups of people. In this case, some of our activities that we might try to do during Lent, to meet together with each other, to talk about spiritual things, to have Lenten retreats and so on, these have been made impossible by current circumstances. But instead of just sitting at home wishing that we weren't, we are going to try to offer various things in order to give spiritual food to people during this period. And this talk is one of those. It's the first in a series of talks that we'll do during Lent, so that people will be fed a little bit through such discussion. I want to say just a few things before we get to the heart of our talk. And the first is, I want to be clear about what we're going to say tonight about the COVID-19 coronavirus and the current situation surrounding it, which is essentially nothing. I don't intend for this to be a talk about our response to the virus or how Christians should behave. I want this to be a spiritual talk about our life and our asceticism in Christ. The devil wants nothing more than to use any circumstance he can find to throw us off of the work of the spiritual life, to throw us off of the necessary task of living Christian lives and growing in our Christian faith. And so our aim tonight, and I hope at all times really, but certainly in our time together today, is to defeat this little ploy of the devil by doing what he would rather that all the forces of the world prevent us from doing, which is to focus on explicitly spiritual things and on the Lenten practice of purifying our souls, which is what this whole season is about. So I'm not planning to talk at all about disease or illness or how to respond or what's going on in the churches, apart from just a few simple prefatory remarks right now. The first is, for those of you who are located in the territory of our diocese of Great Britain and Western Europe, just to reiterate that none of our divine services in any of our parishes are cancelled. We, of course, have restrictions in place. That means that many of them, in fact, most of them at the present moment, cannot take place in the normal manner. They cannot take place with groups of people. But we have provisions in place so that the services themselves are still being offered. Prayers are still being lifted up by the clergymen for all of you, for the whole world. And more importantly, there are measures that I've put in place so that you have access to the Holy Mysteries throughout this period. You will still be able to confess. You will still be able to receive Holy Communion. None of this will be hindered. And all of that has been explained to you, I hope, by your priests. Our diocese has published information on this. But you need to be very confident that this situation is not going to stop the Church from ministering to her faithful, even though we might have to be a little creative about how we do that in certain ways. And for those who are at home, and again, it's a great majority of the faithful now in our diocese and throughout the world, our diocese is very much committed to making sure that the time that you're spending at home, even though it may be forced upon you, is something that can be spiritually profitable and should be spiritually profitable. So we have been making available Lenten readings for you on the diocesan website. And we started this Sunday a practice of providing for all of the Lenten major days, and it will carry on through all of the Sundays of Lent, as well as all of the major days, the Great Canon Wednesday, Akathist Saturday or Friday night, and so on. We will provide for you via the diocese's website all of the texts of all of the hymns and all of the services that are being said in the church, as well as some other things. We'll provide the life of Saint Mary for you in French and Russian and English. We'll provide the Ladder of St. John in multiple languages, and so on. All of this is meant to be a resource for you so that if you're not able to come into one of our temples for the normal prayers, you have resources at your fingertips to join in prayer with those services nevertheless. And there's also a special collection of prayers assembled specifically for this season of epidemic that you can pray at home with your family whenever you wish. There are morning prayers, evening prayers, and so on, specifically tailored for this. All of that's provided for you, and wherever you are in the world, you're welcome to access these things. And finally, the last preface before we get on with things is just to ask that you, especially in this season, pray for our bishops and patriarchs and holy synods, because there are a lot of decisions that have to be made, often very quickly, about how to respond to government restrictions and so on in each place. And it puts an additional burden on the hierarchs of the church and on our synods. So please remember them in your prayers as we go about our time. That's all that we're going to say now about that. We're going to move on with what I hope can be some spiritual discussion. I should say I have never done a Facebook, whatever this is, live stream before. Someone has helped me set it up. I believe that you can ask questions via the comments column. So if you do have questions as we go along, you are free to pose them via that method, and I will try my best to respond to them. I'm not necessarily committing myself, but we'll try our best as we move along. May God bless us as we seek to grow in our spiritual life. I said that the theme for this evening would be insights from the desert for our struggles of Great Lent. And what I mean by the desert is specifically the writings of the Desert Fathers and the examples of the fathers and mothers who lived in the desert. We still have fathers and mothers who live in the deserts. But when we speak of the Desert Fathers, we're normally speaking to a collection of early monastic pioneers, if you want to think in that way, who inhabited the deserts of Egypt and Palestine from around the 4th century through the 6th, 7th, 8th. It is a rather ambiguous period in terms of definition. There are some later examples, a few earlier, but that's kind of the heart of what we speak of when we say the Desert Fathers. There are desert mothers as well, some very notable ones, but as is the case in our normal church language, we use fathers collectively. This is a period in the history of our church when monasticism as an institution was fairly young. One of the Desert Fathers was St. Anthony the Great. I'm going to mention him a little bit tonight, who is known as the father of monasticism. Even though he most certainly was not the first monk, he exhibited a kind of paternity for monastic life, by which we still remember him even in the present day. Another of the Desert Fathers was Pachomius the Great of Egypt, who is known as the father of Cenobitic or communal monasticism. So we really are in the period where these traditions as institutions of the church are being developed. They are something new that had not existed before, certainly not in the kind of way that we find emerging here. By the way, I note someone has a comment saying they can't see. I'm hoping that most of you can see and hear, and that the fact only one person is saying they can't means it's not a problem. I'm going to carry on then, since I believe most of you can in fact hear me. Why are the Desert Fathers interesting for us? We live in a totally different world. We certainly are not living in the 4th or 5th century, and most of us at least, certainly all of us gathered here, are not living in the Egyptian desert. The lives of the Desert Fathers were in many ways lives totally different from those experienced by most modern day Christians. They exemplified, these fathers and mothers, a radical departure from the world around us. They left everything and everyone, and they left not only individuals and homes, they left whole societies and ran to the most remote and extraordinary of environments that they could find. And they did this on purpose. They chose the desert because the desert was where the demons live. The desert was where life was hard. So not only do they exemplify this radical departure, but also the fiercest asceticism. They were seeking after and grabbing after a life that was specifically and intentionally difficult. You had to work to provide the most basic necessities of life. And beyond that, to make spiritual progress, you had to toil, often at the point of great need. You had to fend for yourself against brigands, against nature. You had to feed yourself in environments where food and water were hard to find. And you had to support yourself with whatever was at hand. Basket weaving was a very common thread amongst the inhabitants of the early deserts. And indeed, apart from these physical structures of life, the Desert Fathers embraced a life that most of us cannot comprehend, a life of complete self-renunciation and absolute monastic obedience to a community and to the abbot of that community. All of us live in some degree of obedience. Too many people don't live very well in obedience, but very few people today, certainly living in the world, can imagine the kind of obedience, the severity of obedience that was sought by those in the desert. So in so many ways, their lives are totally different from ours. And the commitment to the Christian project was very different from ours. And yet, theirs are words that seem to speak to us, not just across the generations, but across such radically different contexts of life. And indeed, many people who struggle to read the writings of the fathers of the church, St. Basil, St. Athanasius, St. Gregory, and so on, which are often dogmatic and theological and scientific in many ways, many people who struggle with their writings and that kind of language rush to the Desert Fathers and embrace them and love them, as if these fathers speak with a voice directly to their hearts. Why is this? Why is it with so many differences between them and us? There's one characteristic, perhaps above all, that puts these fathers uniquely into our frame of reference despite all those differences. And that is the encounter that we find in them with a radical simplicity of adhering to the gospel and the commandments of the Christian life. What really stands out, if you've read the writings of the fathers, we can't really say the writings of the Desert Fathers, but the sayings of the fathers that were written down about them. If you've ever read them, one of the things that stands out in those sayings immediately is this incredible simplicity of obedience, this incredible simplicity and literality of the gospel. They listen, they hear, and they do. And that's it. Their action is an immediate response to what is fed into their heart through the words given to them in the scriptures or by their holy fathers. They don't need this to be mediated through an education. They don't need it to be mediated through long discourses and diatribes. They simply need to hear the word of the life, and then they get up and they do it. They do it. And it's this radical direction, this directness of the gospel encountered and lived, of a commandment given by Christ and then followed, without all of the analysis and the analytical reflection by which we ourselves too often characterize our approach to the gospel. When we encounter that immediacy, that directness, it touches our hearts. And so the sayings of these Desert Fathers, which have been collected for us in various collections, they're inspiring to us precisely because they are so different from what we normally encounter. They are not treatises. They are not long books. They are not studies. They are not thought through reflections and analyses of Christian virtue or life. What we encounter in the Desert Fathers are tiny little stories, sometimes just a sentence, a paragraph, little moments, visions of a Christian life in action. And this is what touches us. This is what rips through the centuries directly into our hearts, and why there's so much love for these sayings. But of course, we have to be very careful because we're prone to making everything conform to our image. And our image in modern society tends to be of people who are highly analytical, highly structured, systematic. We want everything to be analyzed according to bigger systems of belief. We want to fit everything into its bigger context, put everything in dialogue with everything else. And so, being what we are and being how we are, we tend to force everything else into this mold that we're comfortable with. And so we have a risk with the wisdom of the desert and with the sayings of the fathers of the desert. We have the risk that we would do precisely what would make them the things that don't matter to us. We risk turning them into more of the same, making their little stories into treatises, however short, that we then analyze, that we then systematize, that we transform into our own intellectual image. But the lives of the fathers of the desert, recorded for us in their sayings, these are texts that really are not meant to be studied. They are meant to give fuel to a Christian life that is lived, something that is actually done, in emulation of those we are talking about, who actually listened and did. I remember being a student and reading the life of St. Anthony the Great of Egypt for the first time. And it's recounted by St. Athanasius, his biographer, how St. Anthony went into church as a young man and heard the gospel. And he said it was as if it was being read directly to him, as if Christ was speaking directly to him. And Christ said in the gospel, if you want to follow me, go, sell what you have, give it to the poor, and then come and follow me. And what did he do? St. Anthony went and he sold everything that he had, and he gave it to the poor, and he followed Christ, and he walked with him into the desert. And I remember reading that for the first time, thinking, this is the obvious response. We in the modern world, we want to interpret everything through our own circumstances. Selling what you have must be a metaphor. Giving it to the poor must be a metaphor that can mean doing away with some of our attachments, doing away with some of our cares, doing some good for other people. But for St. Anthony, it meant what Christ said. If you want to follow him, Anthony, take all of these things that you have, sell them and give them away. And that's exactly what he did. Now, we may not find ourselves in circumstances where we can do exactly that. We may not be ready to do exactly that. But that immediacy of hearing the gospel, that immediacy of letting Christ speak and then acting on what he says, that is a characteristic that we must regain in our own lives. Because far too often we mediate the gospel through our own intellect so severely that by the time we're done dwelling on it, done thinking about it, debating about it, dialoguing over it, there's nothing left. We have spent the whole day, the whole year, our whole life, and have actually done none of what God asks us to do. That's the situation that we must avoid. And that's what the Desert Fathers are so potent in teaching us how to escape. And of course, this is what we're supposed to be doing during the Great Fast, reshaping our lives so that they more closely adhere to the life of Christ. This is what Lent is for. It's a period of focus, not just on thinking about God. Lent is not a period of sustained contemplation. Lent is a period of action, which is why we focus so much on physical things. Yes, people can get too caught up in the physical dimensions of a Lenten fast. People can get overly exercised about what they eat or don't eat and so on. But at the same time, modern man needs to focus much more than he does on the physical realities of spiritual life. The life in Christ does not take place entirely in here. The life in Christ is a thing that has to be lived. We have to do it. And what we realize when we try to live this life, when we struggle to actually do as God commands, we realize how much of our life, as we live it, is focused on everything else except Christ's life, and how difficult it is for us when we set our heart to it, to actually follow the commandments. So habituated have we become to doing the opposite, or to doing nothing, or to simply being trapped in our minds. Lent is a period to try to reorientate that through physical means, through spiritual means, through mental means, through every means, in order that our lives can start to imitate Christ and be joined to his. So let's try to get a few gems from the writings of the desert, or the sayings of the desert fathers, that can actually give us some food and some fuel for this project. I'll go through a few themes tonight, as many as we can get through in about an hour or so. So firstly, the desert fathers teach us that the ascetical life, that is the life of interior discipline, the life of Christian discipline and practice, that this needs to be focused on what is given to us by God for our salvation and not on other things. This is sometimes a hard lesson to learn, but God gives us certain things to help us repent and attain sanctification. And other things are beyond the remit of that spiritual work. And those things, even if they are in their own right good, or even holy, sacred things, if they are not given to us and taken up by us with a blessing for the purpose of changing our hearts, they become ascetical distractions rather than ascetical helps. And it is very easy to be distracted from our Christian life and within our Christian life. And it's not just frightening scenarios in the world or around us that can throw us off. One of the most obvious things, though we don't always think about it, but one of the most at-home things that can throw us off the spiritual life is what Saint Ephrem in his Lenten prayer that we repeat so often during these weeks calls idle curiosity. Thoughts that, for the supposed sake of piety, dwell on things that are not immediately pertinent to the transformation of our hearts. Ponder that for a moment, dwelling on things that are not immediately pertinent to the salvation of our hearts, even if those things might be holy in and of themselves. Let me give you one of the sayings of Saint Anthony the Great, the father of monasticism, as I say, he's often called, of whom many sayings are collected in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, apart from the entire life of Saint Anthony, written by Saint Athanasius. Once, it said of Saint Anthony, he was deep in thought about the judgments of God, and he started to ask God questions. If you have read Saint Anthony's life, you're aware that this is something he does regularly. He openly asks God for God's response to various questions in his heart. And once Saint Anthony was dwelling on the judgment of God, and he asked him, Lord, why is it that some people die when they're young and others drag on to extreme old age? Why are some poor while others are rich? Why is it that wicked men prosper, but the just are in need and go without? All of these questions are reasonable questions. And indeed, many very pious men have occupied years of their lives dwelling on precisely these kinds of existential and theological questions. Why do good things happen to bad people? Why is there suffering? Why aren't the just rewarded and the unjust punished in this life, etc.? St. Anthony asks all of these things. And then he hears a voice answering him, saying, Anthony, keep your attention on yourself. These things are according to the judgment of God, and it is not to your advantage to know anything about them. That is from the second saying attributed to St. Anthony in the alphabetical collection of the sayings of the fathers, for those of you who might want to look this up. These things are according to the judgment of God, and is not to your benefit to know anything about them. This is an extraordinary revelation that St. Anthony has. He is asking legitimate questions, to which there are legitimate answers. God does nothing unwisely. The world does not unfold apart from his wisdom or providence. And he is reminded by God that everything is in God's hands, all to his judgment and wisdom. But the critical point for St. Anthony at this moment is that these things are not important for him. I wish more people, more Christian people, would be willing to accept, would be willing to hear this kind of word, that there are things that are not important for your salvation. That's not to say they aren't important overall. That's not to say they don't have value. That's not to say they aren't significant, and in some other context, or for some other person, or at some other point in your life or someone else's, that those questions might not actually have value. But that at this moment, here, now, they are not important to your work of salvation. Perhaps it will be odd to say this in the context of a talk streamed on the internet, but the internet is a wonderful sea of temptations against precisely this kind of virtuous attitude. On the internet, it's possible to have access to opinions on everything, studies on everything, information on everything. And there is a certain point to which that can be useful. But there is also a very important point when that information must be looked at and said, this is to the judgment of God to someone else. It is not what I need, and it is not aiding me in the actual work of repentance. Saint Irenei of Lyon, my own patron saint, once famously said, some knowledge is best left to God himself. We are a generation of people that feels that we must have the answer to everything. And even though we, in essence, understand nothing, we feel that we must understand everything. That if I don't have an understanding of something, an opinion about something, that somehow it isn't real for me. My life isn't engaged in the world around me. Well, these things serve to dilute our hearts. They serve to dilute our attention. And we realize when we chase after all information, including religious information, Christian information, when we spend all of our time hunting after quotations and thoughts and notes, and at the end of the day, we have done nothing to actually save our souls. We've done nothing to actually repent of our iniquity and live a more godly life. That's when we start to realize the wisdom that was revealed to St. Anthony. Some knowledge is God's. These things are not useful to you. Keep your attention on yourself. This leads directly into a second point that I'd like to glean out of the writings of the desert, or the examples of the desert. That while we have to avoid focusing on things that do not lead us into works of repentance, we must actually take our lives into our two hands and get about doing the works that do. Christian life is not about theories or ideas or reflections. Christian life is about action, taking a life that is in need of repair, actively bringing it to the physician who can heal it, and then following his directions for its repair and revivification. Christ gives us healing instructions and commandments. We refer to these as the commandments of God, or the law of God, zakon Boží, by which we don't just mean law in a legalistic sense, but the entirety of God's self-revelation and his revelation of what man needs. These are instructions. They're meant to be followed. One wouldn't go to an earthly doctor and receive a diagnosis for a cure, do this, and this, and then ignore it, and then lament that we don't get any better. And yet, too often we do precisely this in the spiritual life. Christ gives us his commandments. He gives us the instructions to repair what is broken in us. And then we don't do it. And we wonder why our spiritual life doesn't improve. Sometimes in addressing this tendency, the Desert Fathers can be very blunt. If I can refer to Saint Anthony once again, a brother once came to him and said, "Pray for me." And I'm reading from number 16 of the sayings of Saint Anthony. A brother once came to him and said, "Pray for me." And the old man replied, "I will have no mercy upon you, nor will God have any, if you yourself do not make an effort and do not pray to God." The bluntness here is important. Too often our present generation, even in the church, is far too gentle and recoils from godly chastisement. But listen to these words. "I will have no mercy on you, nor will God have any, if you yourself do not make an effort." St. Anthony is loving and merciful precisely in his severity. The brother who's coming to ask him wants St. Anthony to do all the work. "You pray for me. You make my life better. You grant me a spiritual existence." And how often do we do exactly the same thing in our own spiritual life, in our own ascetical endeavors? We beg for mercy, but we don't do anything. We ask for deep prayer, but we make no real effort at it. We beg for absolution, but we don't really want to repent of our sin. We seek charity from God, but we're unwilling to love our brother or our sister. We have to work. The life in Christ is not given. It is, as Christ himself says, taken. And more than this, it is taken by force. Christ gives all that we need, but we have to grab it with our two hands and pull it into our hearts and shape our life around it if we wish to have any transformation of our existence through what we have been given. Another one of the Desert Fathers, Abba Arsenius, says something along these lines in one of his sayings. It's the fifth recorded of Abba Arsenius of the desert. Someone once said to Blessed Arsenius, "How is it that we, with all of our education and our wide knowledge, we get nowhere? While these Egyptian peasants," there was a group of Egyptian Libyan peasants visiting the monastery then, "why is it that we, with all of our education, get nowhere? While these peasants acquire so many virtues." And Abba Arsenius said to him, "We indeed get nothing from our education, but these peasants acquire the virtues by hard work." Work is a necessity for growth in the spiritual life. To be certain, God gives freely. There's no price. We cannot earn what he gives, and he gives it lovingly and generously to all. But God gives to his children whom he has made as free individuals. And we have therefore in that freedom to respond to what we're given. Else the gift has no effect on us. We get nothing from our education, Arsenius says, but these peasants, they attain the virtues by work. Obviously, we're not going to speak ill of education. Education is a good thing, and it can be a very blessed thing, and it can help a person attain to a holy life. But in and of itself, it is just a tool. And indeed, if we have a temptation in our modern world, it is to make an idol out of education, to make an idol out of learning and thinking and analyzing, to the point where all we do is think and analyze, and we stop actually doing. And then we find ourselves in exactly the situation that Arsenius is describing in this encounter. We get nothing, and yet all around us are people who acquire the virtues by working, by putting their hand to the millstone and actually laboring for God. There's another story relating to Abba Anthony of the desert, about a group of brothers who kept coming to him, asking for counsel, but were unwilling to do anything in their spiritual lives. They wanted from him, he was a very well-known father and saint, they wanted from Anthony in the desert some kind of guruistic leadership. Give us your holy words, give us your spiritual message, and then we will be holy people. But they wouldn't do anything. So I want to read you this, it's saying 19 as they're numbered in the alphabetical collection of Abba Anthony. The brethren came to Abba Anthony and said to him, "Give us a word, Father. How are we to be saved?" And the old man said to them, "You've heard the scriptures. That should teach you enough. Go do it." But they said, "No, we want to hear from you too, Father." Then the old man said to them, "The gospel says, if anyone strikes you on the cheek, turn to him the other cheek also." And they replied, "We cannot do that." So the old man said, "Well, if you cannot offer the other cheek, at least allow one cheek to be struck." "We cannot do that either," they said. So he said, "If you're not able to do that, then simply don't respond to evil with evil." And they said, "We cannot do that either." And then the old man looked to his disciple at his side and said, "Prepare a little brew of corn for these invalids. If you cannot do this or that, what can I do for you? What you need is prayers." This story to me often speaks to a kind of temptation of the modern world, because we are, as a modern generation, prone to seeking guruistic advice in the place of real spiritual eldership. People today do not know what eldership looks like. They're not prepared to live an obedient life, but they want the magic that comes from some elder, from some spiritual teacher, from some beloved priest or bishop or monk, as if it comes from his fingers, it will change their hearts. This is a real spiritual temptation in our generation, and St. Anthony was facing it already in the 4th century. And St. Anthony responds by saying, look, if you can't do anything, if you won't follow any of the commandments, what can we do? We'll just say some prayers and God be with you. But you're never going to grow spiritually like this. You're never going to attain holiness in this manner. The fathers are telling us we actually have to heed the law of God, his divine commandments, if we want to grow in his life. And this ought to be straightforward to everyone. This ought to be completely obvious to every Christian. And yet, the single biggest hindrance to spiritual growth in our world today is precisely that people do not heed this. They crave spiritual teaching, or what they think is spiritual teaching, what sounds to our ears like spiritual teaching. They're quick to pass around quotations of their favorite fathers or some elder, or internet memes pertaining to whatever theme they want to emphasize and focus upon, with verses from the scriptures, verses from the saints. They're quick to quote our sacred texts and ensure that they demonstrate outward signs of a Christian life. But people today don't want to follow the commandments of God and actually make a change in their hearts, an actual change, a break from who they are and a becoming of someone new. This, as I say, is the biggest hindrance that I see faced in a general sense in our world today. It's not that people are struggling with too many or too great temptations, that the world is too hard, that there isn't enough spiritual wisdom or teaching to go around. People have lamented this in every day, including when they were standing in front of Christ incarnate. They made precisely these excuses to his apostles and to him. We have no teacher. There is no elder. We have no truth. The temptations of life are too great. But these things have never been and are not now what really hinders us in our spiritual life. They are, in fact, precisely that, excuses that we use. Temptation is not the antithesis of a spiritual life. It's a part of what we have to consider normal in this broken world. I say normal with some hesitation because, of course, in the world as God would have it, as he fashioned it, and had we not disfigured it, and were we not continuing to disfigure the world with our sin, there would be nothing normal at all about temptation or evil or anything else. But in this world as we have it, it is an expected dimension of our existence. And therefore, it is something that God can put to use, as he puts to use everything else that we encounter in this life, and which indeed we find useful in seeking to struggle towards him. Abba Antony, who we've been quoting from very much, he said to another one of the great fathers of the desert, Abba Pimen, the shepherd is what Pimen means in Greek. He said to Abba Pimen at one time, "This is the great work of man, always to take responsibility for his own sins before God and before others, and to expect temptation to his last breath." You see, St. Anthony was not seeking to flee from temptation. He and the other monks following his example did not rush into the desert to run away from the temptations of the world. They ran into the desert because that's where they would face spiritual temptation. I remember as a student reading the life of St. Anthony, and my instructor said to me, "Why do you think the monks went into the desert?" And I, in my foolishness, gave some flowery response about how the desert is tranquil and peaceful, and there are beautiful vistas on which one can contemplate the depths of God's love and majesty and all of this. At which point my instructor said to me, "Have you ever been to the desert?" And of course I had not at that point. I said, "No, I haven't." And with some shaking of the head, he said to me, "The monks went to the desert because that's where the demons lived. They went there in order to be tempted, not to escape temptation. They wanted to escape the chains of the world, but not temptation itself." Indeed, St. Anthony says even more dramatically, whoever has not experienced temptation cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. And in another place, the same St. Anthony said, without temptation, no one is saved. We need to hear these words because so often we use temptations and our struggles of the present moment or any other moment precisely as excuses not to grow in the spiritual life. I would exercise myself in virtue, but I have this facing me. I have this struggle to deal with. I have these obligations, whatever it might be. We use our temptations to prevent us from life. St. Anthony is saying you need them to spur you on to life. We have to be careful when we talk like this. We can't say that temptation is an existential requirement. God has to have us be tempted in order for us to grow. This is an easy philosophical trap to fall into. Very, very many people do. But you can respond to it simply by saying the fathers of our church in general don't deal in hypothetical abstractions. They're not interested in a possible existence where there is no evil, a theoretical existence where there's no devil and no temptation. You can philosophize about that all you want. It will do you little good. We live in this world, and in this actual world, this concrete world in which we find ourselves, there are demons, there is a devil, there is evil, there is sin, and there is temptation. And so the question is, what are you going to do with those temptations as you encounter them? God adjusts the temptations that we face so that we're never overwhelmed by them. This is a promise that he himself makes in the gospel, that we will never be given a cross that we cannot bear. And the fathers of the desert are cognizant of this as well. St. Anthony, for all that he stresses the need to face temptation, also says that God does not allow the same warfare, the same temptations to this generation as he did in former. For men are weaker now, St. Anthony says, and they cannot bear so much. God knows what we can bear, and he gives us just enough to be useful and to help us through these struggles into great life. Let me read you a little saying of Abba John the Dwarf. Such a wonderful way to be remembered throughout history. Abba John obviously was exceedingly small. In the 14th of the sayings attributed to him, it says this: Abba John the Dwarf said, "Here is what one of the old men in a deep revelation said to us. 3 monks were standing at the edge of the sea, and a voice came to them from the other side, saying, 'Take wings of fire and come here to me.' The first 2 did so and reached the other shore, but the third remained, crying and weeping exceedingly. But later wings were given to him also, but these were not wings of fire, but weak and without strength, so that only with great difficulty did he reach the other shore, sometimes swooping under the water, sometimes managing to stay above it. So it is," Abba John continued, "with our present generation. If they are given wings, they are not of fire, but wings that are weak and without power." This is the kind of beautiful imagery that the fathers often call up. God wants us all to fly along on wings of flame. But it should be said that Abba John is not saying, "Oh, these pitiful men, God gives them second best." What Abba John is revealing is that these men, through their lack of faith, their lack of real zeal, cannot manage the wings of fire. The same gifts are offered to them, but they don't know what to do with them. They cower in their fear. They cower in their apparent lack of ability. And so they are given different wings, weak wings, but the wings that they need, the wings that will see them through to the other side. Even though their journey may be more difficult than those who fly with the wings of flame in this vision that Abba John had. They will sometimes be dunked under the water, but perhaps that is precisely what they need in order for them to learn to trust the one who gives them flight. Abba John is revealing something very profound. When we are given struggles, when we are given temptations, when we are given trials, when God responds to the weak faith of our generation by giving us what seems to be less than what he gave to the great saints of a generation before, or a century, or a millennium before, never think that it is less. It is different. God customizes, if we can use this modern idea, the gifts of his mercy so that they are what is useful to the present generation. What use are wings of fire to me, who am so broken and debased that I would have no idea what to do with them or how to take them up and use them for good? What use would be such exalted things that the great saints were able to use to their glory, but which I in my weakness haven't the faintest idea how to approach? God could, yes, give me the same things, but what good would it do me? Instead, God conforms his mercy to our lowliness. It is not that he is giving us less, that he loves us less, or he enables us with less spiritual power. He gives us precisely what we need in order to make spiritual ascent. This is a spiritual principle that we have to learn and absorb in our hearts. God has not given more to other generations. He has given differently. God has given to them what they needed, and to us what we need, to do what needs to be done. Yes, perhaps what he gave to another generation or another individual was more highly exalted than what he has given me. But for him to give me that would not be a greater thing for me. It would be much lesser. As if I give to a little child solid food rather than milk. Yes, solid food is a greater thing for an adult, but for a little child, it is inedible. It is counterproductive. That gift would actually hurt the child. The Lord gives to us what we need as we grow. Therefore, we have no excuse not to make our spiritual ascent, not to work to live the virtues. We cannot claim that God has not given us the food for that journey. We cannot claim that we have too many temptations or that those temptations are too great. Only our excuses, never our circumstances, prevent our spiritual growth. And this is something that the fathers of the desert knew very well. And this is why they speak against that tendency to make excuses so strongly and so repeatedly. We must actually engage in the ascetical life. And yet, there's a warning that comes even with this, because it's possible to engage in the ascetical life, to start seeking actually to follow the commandments of God and to receive from him his promised grace, but to become deluded in what we are doing, because we do it without wisdom, without guidance. One of the sayings of St. Anthony the Great has him say to those gathered around him, "Some have afflicted their bodies by severest asceticism, but they lack discernment, and so they remain far from God." We have to remember that all of these disciplines that the Church gives us, whether it's physical fasting, whether it's spiritual reading, whether it's the type of prayer and the practice of prayer in which we engage, all of these things are tools that the Lord has given through his Church for the purification of the heart. But like any tool, if it is misused, it can cause harm rather than good. And it's possible to fast with great severity and not only not improve your spiritual life, but make it much worse. It's possible to have an approach towards prayer that is so pharisaical and so militaristic that engaging in that activity leads your heart away from the love of God, not towards it. Every tool that God gives must be exercised with discernment, discretion, and guidance, obedience to the one who has given it, which is ultimately God, who conveys that to us through his Holy Church. That's another wonderful saying. I'm quoting St. Anthony the Great a lot tonight, but I think for good reason. He has so many wonderful examples to give us. Some brothers came to find St. Anthony to tell him about visions they were having. Visions. And to find out from him if these visions were true or if they came from the demons. They had a donkey which had died on the way. I'm reading now, this is the 12th saying attributed to Abba Anthony the Great in the sayings of the Desert Fathers. These men had a donkey which died on the way to see Abba Anthony. When they reached the place where the old man was, he said to them, before they could ask him anything, "How was it that your little donkey died on the way here?" And they said, "How do you know about that, Father?" And he told them, "The demons showed me what happened." And they said in reply, "That was what we came to question you about, for we fear that we were being deceived, for we have visions which often turn out to be true." Thus the old man convinced them by the example of the donkey that their visions were coming from the demons. I love this little saying because it speaks to a temptation that is very frequent in our modern day, which is people's reliance on visions, on feelings, on emotions, which are the things least to be relied upon of all in the spiritual life. Not simply because it's very easy to have feelings and emotions that we generate ourselves. If you want to experience an interior warmth of ecstasy. Just try hard enough and you'll generate that feeling in yourself. It won't be real in terms of an actual spiritual revelation, but you will really feel something. You can generate such things within your mind, within your heart, even within your flesh, so that you feel certain things. And people are very keen to have a dream and to attach to it profound significance, or to have a thought and attach to it divine origination. Not only ignoring the fact that the mind can produce its own distractions, but also ignoring that we have an enemy in the spiritual life. That the devil is real, the demons are real, and that they actively work against us. That there is the provocation of the intellect and of the heart by forces that seek us not to follow God, but to follow anything other than him and his will. And yet people want to follow these fleeting things as if they were the gospel, even though the gospel is sitting right in front of them. They would rather hear a vision in their sleep than the word of Christ spoken in the middle of his church. They would rather hear a voice in their head than the voice of the deacon or the priest proclaiming the commandments of God and the mercy of God and the revelation of God. They would rather see a vision in their mind than go into the temple and behold the vision of angelic worship and the heavenly throne of the eternal King. This is the state in our present generation. We are easily deceived because we seek after deception. So in following the ascetical life of the church, which is a life of fasting, which is a life of physical work, physical exercises, as well as spiritual work and spiritual labors, we are training the heart to listen to God. We are training the intellect to become something which enables the heart to open itself to divine vision. These are realities that we seek. And yet if we seek them without wisdom and guidance and obedience, then we ultimately seek only our own self-fulfilling delusion. So obedience emerges as one of the key themes in the desert and in our own spiritual life as well. And it's one of these terms that modern man simply does not like to hear. I see on the clock we've reached 8 o'clock. We're going to go on a little bit longer. I trust you won't mind. If you do, you're free to go. No one is holding you here against your will. But I would like to say a few more points before we wrap up for the evening. First, let me say something about obedience. Well, actually, let me not say something. Let me just read a wonderful story about obedience, probably one of the most famous, which also is attributed to the life of the same Abba John the dwarf that I mentioned before. This is, in fact, the first saying attributed to him in the collection of the Desert Fathers, and I'll just read it to you. It was said of Abba John the dwarf that he withdrew and lived in the desert at Scetis with an old man of Thebes. His Abba, taking a piece of dry wood, planted it and said to him, "Water this dead stick every day with a bottle of water until it bears fruit." Now the water was so far away that Abba John had to leave in the evening and could not return before the following morning. At the end of 3 years, the wood came to life and bore fruit. And then the old man took some of the fruit and carried it into the church and said to the brethren, "Take and eat the fruit of obedience." As I say, this is one of the most famous sayings on obedience in the entirety of the world. Take and eat the fruit of obedience. This apparently nonsensical instruction, water this dead stick, which can never bear fruit. And yet he does it with profound diligence, day in and day out, traveling all through the night to collect the water for 3 years without asking a question. And then by God's miraculous grace, the fruit is born as a testimony to what obedience can accomplish. We have to have obedience as a living reality, not as a slavish, drone-like adherence to some set of rules, but as a willingness to submit our heart and our intellect to the wisdom of God that is offered through his church. Only when we are willing to submit our own hearts to God's, in the church, through the church, are we able to overcome that propensity towards self-delusion, towards self-will, towards self-interpretation, and all of those iskushenia that lead us precisely into the sorry spiritual state in which we so often find ourselves. Obedience is the answer. Again, obedience, if exercised wrongly, can also be disastrously problematic. Obedience is another tool, and as we've said already, all tools have to be wielded well. And there is that same guruistic temptation of modern man that I mentioned before, that is always encouraging people to seek after some saintly elder or teacher who will guide them from the mountaintop. And even though they would never frame it this way, what in reality they're asking for is for another person to do the spiritual work for them. In the same way, there's a tendency in modern man to misuse obedience as a kind of mindless slavishness towards another. I will think nothing, say nothing, you tell me everything. But this is not the nature of obedience. That can be one way of exercising obedience in a specific context, usually in a monastery. But obedience is meant to be the offering of the heart towards a power other than itself, precisely so that the heart can be led to make proper choices, to behave appropriately, to appropriate ascetical realities appropriately. I want to finish with one very practical, ascetical area of discipline that the fathers talk about, and then I'll ask if any of you have any questions. We've talked about the need to work, about not being put off by temptation, but using temptation, about discipline, about obedience, about humility, about perseverance, about actually doing what God says to do. One very practical way, then, in which this is exercised, an ascetical discipline that can change the heart to become closer to God's, is the curbing of the tongue. And the fathers say a tremendous amount about this. It's always an irony to hear people talking about silence and talking about curbing the tongue. But there are examples of this in the fathers that are quite astonishing. And I want to share with you three. The first comes from St. Macarius the Great of Egypt, one of the most influential of all of the fathers of the desert. Abba Macarius said to the brothers in the place where he lived when he was dismissing the assembly, "Go now, my brothers." Remember, St. Macarius lived in Scetis, which was a very remote region of the Egyptian desert. When he was dismissing the brothers, he said to them, "Flee, my brothers." And one of the old men asked him, "Where could we possibly flee beyond this desert where we live now?" And Macarius put his finger to his lips and said, "Flee that." And then he went into his own cell and he sat down. Flee that. During Lent, we hear the words of Saint Ephrem, which I already mentioned, reminding us, in the words of our prayer, asking God to help us avoid idle conversation. But indeed, the temptation towards idle talk and harmful talk, and just over-talking, is one of the great hindrances to spiritual life in our day. And it's one that people least are interested in hearing about. "Father, give us a word," people say today. And they want to hear about the Jesus prayer. They want to hear about sanctification or theosis. They want to hear about the ascent of the heart. And if you say to them, "Let's talk about your mouth and the things that you say," they say, "Oh, I want to hear about more exalted things." But it's precisely because we don't deal with the practical things in our spiritual life that we never attain to the exalted ones. The vision of God is not impossible for anyone. But in order to obtain that purity, you have to start purifying yourself. And one of the things that we use, as Christ says in the gospel, to defile ourselves the most frequently and the most thoroughly is our mouth. It is not which comes into the heart of man, into the mouth that defiles him, but out. What we say, how we speak about each other, to each other, about ourselves, about God, about the world. These are the things that prevent the purification of the heart. And so if you want to have a pure heart, start with the mouth. One unattributed saying from the Egyptian fathers is one of my very favorites. And those of you who have been my students or who have known me for many years have heard me say this many times. The complete saying is one sentence long, and it goes like this. If you want to make a spiritual pilgrimage, begin by closing your mouth. I have to say, this has long been and remains, and I can't imagine when it will ever cease to be, one of my most beloved sayings from the fathers of the church. If you wish to make a spiritual pilgrimage, begin by closing your mouth. It's there that we engage in the defilement of heart, from which we are seeking to free ourselves. It is there that we permit into the soul the very things that the whole ascetical life works to rid the soul of. And yet we run after those ascetical things. If I tell people, if I tell my spiritual children, go fast more severely, they will run with energy towards whatever rule I give them. If I say, go make a pilgrimage to this holy site, go say this akafis, they will run. But if I say to them, stop talking about your neighbor, they will fight and fight and fight with me. Over and over again. Oh, give us something more spiritual to do. I know that, but tell me what spiritual thing I can do. That is the spiritual thing. Learn how to speak good of your neighbor, or you will get next to nothing from your other endeavors. And if you can't learn how to speak good, at least learn how not to speak ill. That's the first step. And if you can't refrain from speaking ill, just close your mouth. Despite what our modern world says, you, we are not required to have an opinion on everything. We are not required to have a word in response to every provocation. There are times when silence is the most spiritual response, where silence is the most profound spiritual word. Close your mouth and listen to what God has to say. Saint John of Apamea, another great father of the desert, said this, and this will be my last quotation, I think. If we purify ourselves of wickedness, Abba John says, if we purify ourselves of wickedness, then we will start to see invisible realities. But there is no point, while we are still blind, in asking why we cannot see the light. There's no point in stuffing up our ears and then asking, why is it that we cannot hear anything? When we purify the heart, we will see spiritual realities. Notice how he doesn't give any qualification on this. We might see them. It's possible to attain that vision. He's very direct and very absolute. When the heart is pure, we see God. What causes us not to see him is the impurity here. It's not that God is not making himself visible to us. It's not that we don't have the capacity, physical, spiritual, mental, created, or any other way, to see him. The fathers repeat over and over again that all of those are here. Just a week ago, we celebrated the memory of St. Gregory Palamas for the second Sunday of Lent. whose chief spiritual work, theological work, was to put in dogmatic terms the reminder that everyone can see God, that there is nothing in our constitution that makes it impossible. What prevents us is us, the way we live, the impurity that we instill in our lives. And if you want to actually change that, then start by making a pilgrimage of the mouth. Close it when it doesn't need to be open. When you speak of your brother or your sister, the only words you should ever say are words that emphasize their virtues and cover up their shortcomings. I am disheartened at times by the number of occasions when people come to me as their confessor or as their bishop in order not to share with me the good that they have seen in their sister or brother, but instead the wrong. And there's a legitimate case for this. Obviously, if it's a situation that I'm involved in and I can provide some help and counsel, I will. But how easy it is for us to see the wrong in another person, to speak of the wrong in another person, and to never mention the good. If you want to really make spiritual progress in these days ahead, when you are perhaps trapped in your home, you have very little opportunity to go out, use this as a gift. Make every word that you say about someone else a word of praise, a word of edification. If someone close to you is doing something wrong, point out what they're doing well. Look for their virtues, seek them out. And if they're doing something wrong, don't emphasize it. If you're in a position to help them out of the wrong, help them. But you don't need to talk about your wife's faults to your children, or your children's faults to your husband, or your husband's faults to your friend, your sister's faults to other sisters or brothers. This is not necessary. Start with a pilgrimage here, and the heart will follow. This is the kind of practical wisdom that these fathers in the desert give us. This is why we love them so much, and this is why, despite all of those cultural and contextual differences between them and us that I mentioned as we began, they speak to us with such potency. But of course, even their example will simply become another in a long litany of things we listen to and think about and do nothing with, unless we actually commit ourselves right now to doing what Christ says. Love your neighbor, forgive your brother, guard your thoughts, control your stomach, follow Christ, keep the commandments, and you will attain the kingdom and the vision of God himself. I think that is perhaps a useful place for us to end. I will be happy to entertain a couple of questions if they're submitted. Now, if you submitted it before, I haven't seen it. There's been a long stream of activity, but if you have a question that you'd like me to address now, I'm happy to do so. And then I'll finish with a few words about our next in this series of talks. Actually, while I'm waiting to see if anyone does submit a question, I'll say something about that. Since we announced that we would have these live talks, we've had a tremendous number of people asking for more of them, that this wouldn't be a one-off. And indeed it won't be. Because people are stuck at home, and this can be difficult, especially for people who are not used to it. For monks, it's a kind of a dream, really. But for people who are not used to being at home and in their cells, it can be very difficult. We will this week have another talk on Wednesday evening and on Friday evening. And then next week we will plan to do the same, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, all at this same time, which is 7 o'clock British time. Please bear in mind that the UK switches to summertime at the end of March, which I think is sometime at the end of this week or next week. So you will need to check if you're signing in from America or Russia or somewhere else in the world, because the number of hours difference will change in about a week's time. So please keep an eye on that. It will be 7 o'clock British time this Wednesday, Friday, and all of the same days next week as well. And beyond that, just please watch this space. So I'll just quickly look at a few questions that are coming in. I asked for 1 and 2, and I have about 50, but I'll do my best to answer a few. Where does one find the balance, Philip asks, with the tools that we mentioned? How would you know when you're using a tool to your benefit to get closer to God? This is an excellent question, and it comes back to this idea of obedience. None of us has the ability of our own self to look at our life and what we're doing in the Christian life, and to objectively assess if we're doing everything right or if we're going astray. And all of us, every one of us, has the propensity to take something that could be good and misuse it in a way that ultimately is destructive. The only way that you can be certain not to fall into this is not to be alone. You must submit what you're doing to the church. And this is a living reality. The church is not a set of books. The church is a living body. And the priests are appointed and given grace by God specifically to help you in this regard. The grace that comes upon a priest when he is ordained and when he is given that grace of spiritual fatherhood is precisely a grace to help discern with you the things that you are doing that are good for you and the things that are bad for you and the things that need to be adjusted. And as we mature spiritually, we find ourselves able to see some of that more clearly without having to turn as often to our spiritual father or priest for assistance and clarification and help. But none of us reaches a point in this life where we are no longer in need of submitting our hearts in this living way for instruction and change. None of us. The greatest saints still went and said confession, still went and opened their hearts to the guidance of spiritual elders. In the sayings we heard today, many of these were words between saints. Abba John going to Abba Piedmon, Abba Anthony going to Abba Macarius. These are saints seeking the guidance of each other. So there is no one who reaches a point where they can say confidently, I know that what I'm doing is right. If you find yourself saying that, you are definitely wrong. Right? And that is the surest sign that we have confidence in ourself that needs to be expunged. So we must heed the guidance the church gives, both in kind of her general written form, but also in that living way through the priests and our spiritual fathers. Someone says, coming from the perspective of a non-Christian, that surely divine intervention accessible to previous generations would start more people on the journey in a greater than the normal process. For example, I'm not sure that that's true, Josh. Every generation seeks after a sign and says, if only I had a big sign like Joseph had, or like Moses had, or you pick your example from the earlier days. If only we had a sign like that, we would believe. Christ himself responds to this. An evil generation seeks after a sign. You have what you need. And the point is, if we had all of those signs, we would be seeking something else. We would be making another excuse. God gives us what we need. We must use it and respond to it. Remember that these people who received such signs often went astray, often fumbled. Moses brought divine revelation directly to the people, and he went away for a few minutes to the mountaintop, and he came back and they were all building a calf, an idol that they could bow down and worship. All the signs that they had seen, the parting of the waters, manna from heaven, not enough to stir their hearts. So no, God knows what we need. God knows what our intellect and our generation requires, and he gives us precisely that. Let us look at another question. Many of you are just kindly giving thanks, and it's nice to see some familiar names from around the world here. I think that those are the main questions that have come in that we'll respond to tonight. So again, we will meet in 2 days' time, Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock, then again on Friday. And as I said at the outset, but for the benefit of those who might not have been here then, our diocese here of Great Britain and Western Europe has produced, we actually did it yesterday and today, materials for all of the main days of Great Lent ahead of us, for each Sunday as well as the significant days during the week. For those of you who are not able to go into churches because of the current quarantine restrictions and so on, you will find from our website of the diocese all of the texts for each day. Coming up, we have the Sunday of St. John of the Ladder. You'll have all of his texts from the Triodion in English and Church Slavonic. You'll have the texts of the saints of the day in both languages. We will give you the Ladder of Divine Ascent this weekend of St. John so that you can read that as well, his main work. And we'll continue to provide you with these resources for each significant day during the fast, so that if you're not able to get into church, you can still join in the prayers and the hymns of the church from home. And there are some specific prayers in there also for this time of epidemic and pandemic. So don't be afraid, let your hearts be at peace, and continue to focus on the thing that is important, spiritual growth. Don't let this fear that's in the world right now, as legitimate as it may be, don't let it stop you. Don't let it hinder you at all from growing in the Christian life. In fact, do what great saints have done in every generation and take this as its own opportunity. You now have more time to be at home. You have more time to do spiritual reading, to pray, to fast, to love your family, to develop a good heart. Do these things. And then this period of trial will be one of spiritual victory as well. God bless all of you. Have a peaceful and a holy evening. Amen.